Let me introduce Professor Peter Parolin. Peter is the chair of the English department at the University of Wyoming. He earned his PhD and was hired by the university back in 1997. His PhD is from the University of Pennsylvania. He reveals his Canadian origins by having, well, let me tell you something. Let me tell you a little story. I grew up in Sheridan, and in the middle of high school, my father moved the whole family to a new job in upstate New York near Buffalo, Wyoming. I'm sorry, Buffalo, New York, sorry. And what's important about Buffalo, New York is the town north of it. Many of you may have been there. It's called Niagara Falls. And if you've ever been to Niagara Falls, you'll know that there's an American side and the Canadian side, and the Canadian side is so much nicer than the American side. And so you cross the border, and when you cross the border into Canada to see the Canadian side, you are in Ontario. And as a fresh, young Western high school student showing up from Wyoming in New York, I knew within about 6 months that one of the most exciting theater experiences you could have without going down to New York City was in Stratford, Ontario, at the Shakespeare Summer Festival. And Peter has been, would you say a scholar in residence, something like that, at the Summer Shakespeare Stratford Festival since 1995. And he's been giving talks and lectures and helping add an academic blend to that great theater experience there. So anyway, Peter's a lot of fun on that kind of stuff. Let me also say that Peter is one of our star teachers at the university. He's won 2 Mortarboard Top Profs awards. Mortarboard is our Student Honors Association. He's won the Top 10 Teacher Award 5 times in the last 12 years. He's won Teaching Excellence Award from the university's honors program 5 times. And he is a coveted winner of what we call the Golden Apple Award down at the university, which is the award you get for really wowing the freshmen. Freshmen need good teaching because it's one of those things that helps them think, oh, university is good, it's fun, it's useful, I could stay here. And Peter, we only give those once a life. So Peter has won one of those.
So the 10-year-old freshman, and we'll all get along this way.
So now that I've completely built him up, let me welcome Peter Parolin, who's going to speak to us on the role of a king, leadership, and theatrics in Shakespeare's King Henry IV.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks, Paul, and thanks to everyone. I just joined Paul in saying how grateful I am to all the people on the ground in Jackson at the museum and the library that have put a ton of work into making this day possible. So Amy and Una and Rebecca, and it's in Walt and Joanne, Tulene. It's been wonderful coming up here and having a chance to represent the university and meet so many new people and see some wonderful old friends as well, and Ned for the accommodations. Thank you. And Paul Flesher as well. He's been thanking people all day, but he's done a ton of work to make this happen at the University of Wyoming. So thank you very much, Paul, for everything you've done to make this program work. Thank you, Paul. This is for you, Paul, and Marcia Britton at the Wyoming Humanities Council. It's just great to be here. I'm very excited. And I was the third of the 3 speakers to actually come up with a topic. So I knew what Rod was talking about, and I knew what Jean was talking about, and I thought, God, I'm not sure that I have in my Renaissance literature repertoire anything that speaks exactly, that's going to tie us together beautifully. But I thought to build on Jean's discussion of politics and Rod's discussion of the relationship between performance and culture, I would choose Shakespeare's Henry IV Part 1 to talk about, because in that play, politics, I think, is something of a performance art. So it seems to me maybe that's a way to think about the political and cultural links that link our 3 talks. I want to talk about how theater is used in the play to build political legitimacy and consolidate political power. Mostly I want to look at the figure of the Prince of Wales in this play, Prince Hal. Today this character is probably most familiar to us from Shakespeare's later play, Henry V, and from Kenneth Branagh's wonderful 1989 film version of that play. Has anybody read Henry V or seen the film of it? So, okay, so a number of you know what becomes of this character, and how about the play Henry IV? Has anybody read the play, or maybe a while since college years? Okay, few people have read it, great. You know, in Henry V, the king leads an outnumbered English army into France. They win an incredible upset military victory, and Henry V becomes the greatest hero in English history. In Henry IV, Part 1, all that glory is still in the future, the present is very uncertain. The prince hasn't yet become the hero king, and it looks like he may refuse the role altogether. He's not studying his political science books at college. He's off in the taverns, he's hanging out with reprobates, he's drinking, he's sleeping the time away, he's planning practical jokes and robberies, and his father, the king, is very, very worried that he's got a really bad heir to the throne on his hands. So the play Henry IV is partly about the process by which Hal grows up and assumes political leadership. And I wanted to talk about that process today. Before jumping into the Shakespeare portion of the talk, I did want to mention one major set of political ideas that help contextualize Hal's bid for legitimacy. And these are the political ideas of Niccolo Machiavelli, the Florentine political thinker of the early 16th century, who wrote this little book, The Prince. You may have heard of it. And this was, Machiavelli wrote The Prince as a bid to ingratiate himself with the powerful Medici family. He wanted their patronage, so he wrote this little book advising princes on how to gain and maintain power. The Prince, today, am I right, Jean, it's seen as one of the foundational texts in political science, right? Nothing perhaps overly shocking about it, but when it was written, it was an incredibly controversial book throughout Europe in the 16th century, and Machiavelli himself as a figure was hated. His ideas were reviled, but even though he was hated and his ideas were reviled, they still spread. They still spread like many reviled ideas. The more reviled an idea is, the more people want to find out, what's it all about? Right? This is why censorship so often fails as the exact opposite outcome. For those of you that have read Machiavelli, if we could just interact, if I can ask you, because you probably know as well as I do, what are some of the central features of Machiavelli's ideas in The Prince? Yeah. That's the famous quotation, right? The ends justify the means. What does that mean politically? Like, what is it? Whatever
you need to do to get there.
Yeah, the ends are obviously your political goals, and your political goals are of primary importance. Whatever it takes to achieve your goals, go for it. A good, smart prince will go for it. Okay? Other things, anything else that you remember about Machiavelli and his ideas?
Better to look good than be good.
Yes, it's better to look good than be good. Machiavelli has a really supple take on the role of conventional virtue in politics. Right? Before Machiavelli, I think most political theory would say if you're a leader, you're supposed to be good. You're supposed to be morally good. Machiavelli says, not so much. Not so much. It maybe isn't the most important thing for a political leader, certainly one who wants to remain in power, to follow conventional morality. So Machiavelli, for example, will say, yeah, you know, maybe it is good to seem good, but it might be more effective for a ruler occasionally to be bad. Maybe it's good for a ruler to seem generous, but it might be more effective for a ruler occasionally to be parsimonious. Maybe it's good theoretically to tell the truth all the time, but sometimes it's more effective for a ruler to tell a strategic lie. Right? And he's saying, certainly if you want to stay in power, maybe it's better to have maybe theoretically it's nice to have your people love you. But boy, it might be more politically effective to have them fear you. Right? So, so these are some pretty key ideas for Machiavelli. And they would be controversial because? Why would they be such controversial ideas? They fly in the face of morality? Sorry?
Character is not evident.
An integrity of character isn't evident, and Machiavelli would say, oh, integrity of character, morality, this is baby talk. We're talking about politics, right? If you want to survive in the political world, don't go around trying to be good because somebody's going to stab you in the back. You better stab them in the back first. But this is very significant and radical and controversial because Machiavelli is taking morality out of politics, or he's seen to be doing this. And he replaces the world as it ought to be, which was the dominant basis of political theory before Machiavelli, and he replaces the world as it ought to be with the world as it is. Saying it's very well and good to talk about what ought to be, but let's talk about what is if we want to understand politics. Machiavelli also takes God out of politics. So before Machiavelli, European history anyway was dominated by a providential mode of history, where historians would see the working out of history as being a manifestation of God's design. God providentially is making X, Y, and Z happen. Machiavelli replaces this sense of God's guiding hand with the ruler's performance in the political arena. So if a ruler stays in power for decades, the providential historian would say they're still in power because God loves them and God is making sure they stay in power. The Machiavellian historian would say they're still in power because they've ruthlessly crushed their enemies with no mercy for 30 years, right? So the Machiavellian historian takes God out of that arena. The ruler defines him or herself through performance rather than through being God's chosen. Your power isn't about who you are as God's chosen, it's about what you do. It's about your performance in the political arena. So Machiavelli, I think, for this talk, I'm interested in the dimension to which Machiavelli establishes the politician as performer, broadly speaking. And Shakespeare is going to take that insight that the politician is a performer, and he will intensify it in Henry IV. Part 1. So, good. So setting the stage for Henry IV, Part 1, this play is the second play in a tetralogy, in a group of 4 plays about English history. The plays, Shakespeare wrote them between 1595 and 1600. They deal with English history from the period of 1399 to 1415, from the fall of Richard II through to Henry V's great victory over the French at the Battle of Agincourt. And the plays are Richard II, Henry IV Part 1, Henry IV Part 2, and Henry V. So what we'll talk about today is a play that's in the middle of this larger context. The first play, Richard II, is about a king who in many ways thinks like a providential historian. Richard II is a charismatic leader who undermines his own rule through his personal excesses, his transgressions, his extravagance. But even when his subjects are rebelling against him, he doesn't seem very troubled because he feels like God has put me in my place. He wants me here. I'm fine. So his cousin Henry Bolingbroke raises an army against him, and Richard says, for every man that Bolingbroke hath pressed to lift shrewd steel against our golden crown, God for his Richard hath in heavenly pay a glorious angel. Well, the angels don't show up to the battlefield, and Richard is defeated by Bolingbroke, and Bolingbroke takes the crown and becomes Henry IV. Then we get into the Henry IV plays, and a huge part of these plays is about how Henry is now going to construct legitimacy for himself and for his dynasty. Because if you've come to the throne by overthrowing the previous king, your challenge is now how do you construct your authority in such a way that nobody's going to overthrow you. Henry IV tries to do it, tries to unite his people, construct his legitimacy by planning a crusade to the Holy Land. So after he has Richard II killed, he says, I'll make a voyage to the Holy Land to wash this blood off from my guilty hand. So we've got a king who admittedly has some serious damage control that he has to do, and he spends his whole reign doing his serious damage control. Henry IV never gets to go on the Crusades because his own people are so divided against him. There's civil wars throughout his whole reign. So he faces political division at home, and he also faces this really problematic Prince of Wales, this problematic son, his own son hanging out in taverns with a group of reprobates, shows little interest in becoming a responsible king. So another main thing that the Henry IV plays are about is the process by which this prince, Prince Hal, crafts himself into a responsible king who's going to lead England to these famous victories in France. We first meet Prince Hal in the tavern, which is dominated by Falstaff. He is a great fat figure of feasting and festivity and mischief and misrule. He's one of the great Shakespearean comic creations. Falstaff follows his own pleasure. Falstaff doesn't follow the rules of politics and the demands of history. He follows his own pleasure. His own fat, oversized body is the visual symbol that he knows no restraint. He does what he wants. So it's interesting, in being who he is, Falstaff serves for Hal as an alternative model to King Henry. The king follows the demands of history and of political leadership. Falstaff is this alternative father figure for the prince, right? He sort of offers to the prince, if you don't like your dad, if you don't like the responsibility that he represents, come with me. You know, come, let's taste wine and women and song, et cetera, et cetera. So a question is whether Prince Hal is going to define himself as Falstaff's son, or whether he'll define himself as his own father's son. Now, if the king represents the cold world of history and politics, Falstaff represents the world of carnival. And I think the whole idea of carnival is an interesting conceptual tool to get into this play. And we still have the term carnival and carnival celebrations and carnival cruises with us today. What does carnival represent? What is it? Where does it come from and what does it represent?
It's comic inside in party.
Partying. And what was the first part of what you said?
Comical.
Yeah, it's comical, partying, way of being in the world. Sure.
Satirical too.
Good. Carnival is often a time when the people who are powerless have fun by attacking those satirically who are in power. It's a time when hierarchies of power and authority often get inverted. And you'll maybe have parades where they used to, in Shakespeare's time, European pop culture would have parades where like a little boy would dress up and be the bishop, and he'd be the boy bishop for the day. Or maybe the town prostitute would be the queen for the day, right? So it's a way of satirizing or making fun of the established hierarchy just for one day, but still having fun blowing smoke in the face of the authority system. Good. Carnal, excellent. And carnival, the etymology of carnival, it's a Latin etymology coming from carne vale. Carne meaning meat. It is carnal, right? Vale meaning goodbye, right? Carnival literally means goodbye to meat, right? And what day in our calendar is carnival? It's Mardi Gras, which is Fat Tuesday, right? And it's the day when you literally gorge yourself on meat and have an enormous party before going through the deprivations and self-denial that you put yourself through in Lent. Yeah.
Also, there's a lot of color.
A lot of color?
Color. Let's say, like, for example, Venice.
Yes. Yeah, the carnival in Venice or the carnival in New Orleans, it's a time of theater. It's a time of street festivity. It's a time of people dressing up and putting on masks, right? It is a theatrical time. You put on a mask, I don't know why. Is it so that whatever you do on carnival, you'll never have to own up to? Nobody will know it was actually you behind that mask, indulging yourself in all kinds of unspeakable ways. Yeah. Good. So all those things I think are, part of the world of carnival. What else have I put down here? It takes its place, carnival does, on the calendar in relationship to Easter, because both carnival and Easter are determined by where they fall in the lunar cycle rather than by a fixed spot on the calendar, right? So they're defined in relationship to the moon. And in Henry IV, Part 1, Falstaff and his cohorts in the tavern define themselves in relationship to the moon. Falstaff calls himself and his buddies squires of the night's bodies, Diana's foresters, Diana being the goddess of the moon, Diana's foresters, gentlemen of the shade, minions of the moon. And his remarks help define the tavern as a nighttime world of carnivalesque festivity, and the tavern dwellers as minions of the moon are the opposite of the king, because kings often define themselves not as the changeable moon, but in terms of the sun, right? I've just been in France and seeing images of Louis XIV, right? The Sun King, right? It's a great propaganda coup if you can make people believe you are the sun. It's quite astonishing, the hubris of that. But okay, so that's the world of the carnival that Falstaff represents. So when we meet Hal in the tavern, the scene is dominated by carnivalistic play, by eating, by drinking, by joking, by wordplay, by characters calling each other low nicknames, by teasing. In the tavern scenes, the Prince of Wales, who's one of the, obviously he's going to be the next king, he's a high figure in society, he defines himself in shockingly informal terms. He's willing to consort with these lowlifes and meet with them on their own terms. But then, at the end of this first scene in the tavern, all the friends, all the lowlifes leave. They exit the stage, and Hal is alone on stage, and he has a speech, and I want to direct you to the handouts that I gave you, and they look very similar, but the one I want you to look at is the one, it has a little bit of my writing at the top that says from Greenblatt et al., the Norton Shakespeare, and it's page 1195, and there's a long speech in the right-hand column by Prince Harry at the end of Act 1, Scene 2. So have a look at that, because here, the prince is going to speak about himself in the tavern, he's going to speak about his friends, and I think he'll reveal a lot about himself. So I'll read this, and then tell me, and then I'll ask you to tell me what he's revealing about himself as a character and as a political figure. How's he thinking politically? Because he's been on stage, they've had this riotous, carnivalesque scene, everybody goes, and now he's alone with the audience. I know you all, and will a while uphold the unyoked humor of your idleness. Yet herein will I imitate the sun, who doth permit the base contagious clouds to smother up his beauty from the world, that when he please again to be himself, being wanted, he may be more wondered at by breaking through the foul and ugly mists of vapors that did seem to strangle him. If all the year were playing holidays, to sport would be as tedious as to work. But when they seldom come, they wished for come, and nothing pleaseth but rare accidents. So when this loose behavior I throw off, and pay the debt I never promised, by how much better than my word I am, by so much shall I falsify men's hopes. And like bright metal on a sullen ground, my reformation, glittering o'er my fault, shall show more goodly and attract more eyes than that which hath no foil to set it off. I'll so offend, to make offense a skill, redeeming time when men think least I will. It's one of my favorite speeches because it's such a devastatingly good speech. What do you make of it? It's also kind of dense, and if you haven't read Shakespeare for a while, it may be very dense. What's he saying here? What's he revealing about himself?
He's revealing his plan to, well, the fact that he's living this profligate life, it's going to be so much more dramatic when he turns it all around that I think it would be more successful. He's thinking about political success.
Yeah. He's stage managing himself. Right? So when this loose behavior I throw off and pay the debt I never promised, by so much better than my word I am, by so much shall I falsify men's hopes. In other words, I'm going to throw, he's letting the audience know who you just saw on stage with these lowlifes. I'm going to throw this behavior off. And I'm going to make myself even stronger as a king because I've basically created low expectations, right? Nobody thinks I'm going to be a good king. I've got a secret. I'm going to be a great king, right? Anything else there?
Sort of like the prodigal son playing his own return.
Exactly. He's enacting a version of the prodigal son story. I'm going to create this sense. Yeah, I'm in charge of it. And I'm going to come back and I'll blow them away.
What James talked about this morning, he's like the guy who will have beer with.
That was the other thing that I thought united our three talks was mention of beer, because everybody's drinking beer in all three of our talks. And yeah, he's in the tavern, he's drinking beer. He is the guy at the beginning of this play anyway that people want to have a beer with. Yeah? And in a way, maybe the audience in the theater is going to like him too because he's the kind of guy you'd like to have a beer with. But at this moment he's saying, I only look like the kind of guy you want to have a beer with. I'm playing that guy. Yeah?
Because he knows that's what we want.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting that he's got two audiences. He's got his friends in the tavern. He's playing this role for them, and then he's got us in the theater. So he's playing both those audiences, and that's a challenge for the actor playing Hal, because you might have a different relationship with the audience on stage versus the audience in the theater. Okay, is he Machiavellian? Since I opened with Machiavelli, we should come back to Machiavelli. Is he Machiavellian? In what way? What does his Machiavellianism consist of? Exactly. He's lying. And to whom is he lying?
Well, to the people in the town.
Yeah, who are his friends. He's lying to his own friends. I mean, it's quite shockingly calculated, right? It's like if you were hanging out with a bunch of your friends, and then after they leave, to say, you know, those lowlifes, I can't wait till the day that I ditch them. Right, I often ask my students at the University of Wyoming, it would be, what would you think, because I ask them, well, what do you think about this strategy by Hal? Usually they really admire it. They think, wow, he's got it all figured out. And I think partly I think it's because at 18, they love the model of somebody that can have a really good time partying while they're a teenager and then become highly successful in their professional life afterwards. But I will say, what would you think if I came in here and said, yeah, I'm teaching these University of Wyoming students right now while I have to, but as soon as I can get a job at Harvard and ditch these kids, I will do it without a second thought. They don't, then they're like, oh, well, maybe that's not quite as attractive an attitude. And I wouldn't ditch my Wyoming students for Harvard without a second thought anyway. But essentially, this is what this character is doing, right? He is in a calculated way planning this future reformation and lowballing the expectations. And notice that he talks about himself in terms of the sun here, right? If Falstaff thinks that Hal is part of the minions of the moon, he says, herein will I imitate the sun, who doth permit the base contagious clouds to smother up his beauty from the world, right? So who would the clouds be? Yeah, the clouds are his friends, and he says that, you know, that when he please again to be himself, he will break through the foul and ugly mists of vapors that did seem to strangle him. So his friends are kind of like the props, and he's gonna burn them away when the time comes, he's saying. So the theatrical model of statecraft that Hal outlines here, because it is a theatrical model, it's saying you need to play a certain role to create your own political strength. Now, this theatrical model of statecraft becomes most explicit in a later scene in the tavern where Hal and Falstaff act out a scene between the king and Prince Hal. And this is so it's very explicitly theatrical. They say, hey, let's play at acting. Let's be Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland. Let's put on a show in the tavern. It's tricky. Okay, so what essentially happens is the king has finally had enough with his son, and he demands that his son come to see him at court. So in the tavern, all the guys are like, ooh, your dad's mad, he's going to be furious with you. So Falstaff and Hal say, well, why don't we practice? You got to go and see your dad tomorrow, so let's practice today. And I'll play the king, and you can play you, and you tell me what you'll say to your dad, and I'll play back. It's a tricky scene, because the source of the disagreement between the king and the prince will be Falstaff himself. So Hal and Falstaff acting out a scene between king and prince actually turns out to be Hal and Falstaff discussing their own relationship. So for this, if you would take not the piece of paper you were just looking at, but the next piece of paper, and if you would go to the side that starts in the top left-hand corner, Prince Harry has a speech that says, "Do thou stand for my father." Right? It's the top left-hand column. Do thou stand for my father. And I would like to act this out, because I do think we think about Shakespeare as book, as capital B book, and there's no author who is more canonized than Shakespeare. But the plays were written as plays, and I think a lot of their meaning is conveyed when we act them out. So I'm going to take the best role for myself, because I'm shameless. I'm going to play Falstaff. Would somebody be willing to play Prince Hal? Would somebody be willing? Would you be willing to play Prince Hal? Come on up. Thank you very much. We need a hostess. And Prince Hal has quite a few lines, but the other characters don't really have very many lines. Would somebody be the hostess of the tavern? She's basically the barmaid at the tavern. Come on over. Thank you, thank you. We need a Bardolph. Would somebody be Bardolph? Rod, would you be Bardolph? And Rod, you don't have any, you're actually not on for most of this scene, but if you would come and stand over here, or sit over here, and when you enter, it says enter Bardolph running, before you come in, knock on that door and smash it, right? Really knock hard. So if you don't like loud noise, get ready when Bardolph is coming in, because I really want you to knock on that door hard. And then, could I have like maybe 3 people? You won't have lines, but if you would be willing to be the other folks in the tavern and just sort of hang out and watch us play. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Would you? Yeah. And okay, so you two come on down. We're going to use this. Where's the bar? It's a piano bar, so just stand over there. Somebody will come take your order. Okay, and essentially what is happening here is Falstaff is going to start off by putting on the signs of royalty, but he doesn't have a crown, so he has a cushion that he's going to wear. I brought a cushion, and then he uses his knife for the royal scepter, and I was going to bring a knife from my kitchen, but I had to get on a plane to get here. And so I brought my wooden spoon, and I also, and then they didn't do any security checks. I could have easily gotten a knife on the plane, but, and I didn't bring my other. I'm just going to try to make myself look, I have more fat than I would like to have, but I don't think I have enough to play Falstaff. So I'm just going to, and I think and I need the stool. I do need the stool. I'm really sorry, because you looked great up there. Okay, so we're going to take it from Prince Harry, do thou stand for my father, and we're going to go on to the next page, and we'll end with I have much to say on behalf of that Falstaff, okay? So let's just think about how theater in this scene gets used to create political authority and what's going on especially between these two. Where's the power between them, right? Okay, so they have this great idea. Why don't we act out this scene between you and your dad tomorrow?
Do thou stand for my father and examine me upon the particulars of my life.
Shall I? Content. This chair shall be my state, this dagger my scepter, and this cushion my crown.
My state is taken for a joint tool, thy golden scepter for a leaden dagger, and thy precious crown for a pitiful bald crown.
Ha ha ha! Well enough, fire grace be not quite out of thee, now shalt thou be moved. Give me a cup of sack to make my eyes look red, that it may be thought I have wept, for I must speak in passion, and I will do it in King Cambyses' vein.
Well, here is my leg.
Ah, and here is my speech. Stand aside, nobility.
Oh, Jesus, this is excellent sport and faith.
Weep not, sweet queen, for trickling tears are... So you're supposed to be laughing your head off uncontrollably.
Of course I am.
Weep not, sweet queen, for trickling tears are in vain.
Oh, the Father, how he holds his countenance.
For God's sake, lords, convey my tristful queen, for tears do stop the floodgates of her eyes.
Oh, Jesus, he doth it as one of those harlotry players, as I have ever seen.
Peace, good pint pot. Peace, good tickle brain. Harry, I do not only marvel where thou spendest thy time, but also how thou art accompanied. For though the chamomile, the more it is trodden on, the faster it grows. Yet youth, the more it is wasted, the sooner it wears. That thou art my son, I have partly thy mother's word, partly my own opinion, but chiefly a villainous trick of thine eye and a foolish hanging of thy nether lip that doth warrant me. If then thou be son to me, here lies the point. Why, being son to me, art thou so pointed at? Shall the blessed Son of Heaven prove a mitcher and eat blackberries? A question not to be asked. Shall the son of England prove a thief and take purses? A question to be asked. There is a thing, Harry, which thou hast often heard of, and it is known to many in our land by the name of pitch. This pitch, as ancient writers do report, doth defile. So doth the company thou keepest. For Harry, now I do not speak to thee in drink, but in tears, not in pleasure, but in passion, not in words only, but in woes also. And yet, there is a virtuous man, whom I've often noted in thy company, but I know not his name.
What manner of man? and it like your majesty.
A goodly, portly man, in faith, and a corpulent, and a cheerful look, a pleasing eye, and a most noble carriage, and as I think his age some 50, or by your lady inclining to 80. And now I remember me, his name is Falstaff. If that man should be lewdly given, he deceiveth me. For Harry, I see virtue in his looks. If then the tree may be known by the fruit, as the fruit by the tree, then peremptorily I speak it. There is virtue in that Falstaff. Him keep with, the rest banish. And tell me now, thou naughty varlet, tell me, where hast thou been this month?
Dost thou speak like a king? Do thou stand for me, and I will play my father.
Ha! Depose me. All right.
Well, here I am, said.
Okay.
Oops, you skipped.
Did I? Oh, depose me, if thou dost it half so gravely, so majestically, here's the scepter, by both word and matter, hang me up by the heels for a rabbit sucker or poultry's hair.
Well, here I am set.
And here I stand.
Now, Harry, whence come you?
My noble lord from East Cheap.
The complaints I hear of thee are grievous.
Blood, my lord, they are false. Nay, I'll tickle thee for a sweet young prince in faith.
Sweetest thou, ungracious boy, henceforth ne'er looked on me. Thou art violently carried away from grace. There is a devil haunts thee in the likeness of thy old fat man. A ton of man is thy companion. Why dost thou converse with that trunk of humors, that bolting hutch of beastliness, that swollen parcel of dropsies, that huge bombard of sack, that stuffed cloak bag of guts, that roasted Manningtree ox with a pudding in his belly, that revered vice, that gray iniquity, that father ruffian, that vanity in years? Wherein is he good, but to taste sack and drink it? Wherein neat thy cleanly, but carve capon and eat it? Wherein cunning, but in craft? Wherein crafty, but villainy? Wherein villainous, but in all things? Wherein worthy, but in nothing?
I would your grace would take me with you. Who means your grace?
That villainous, abominable misleader of youth. Falstaff, that old white-bearded Satan.
My lord, the man I know.
I know thou dost.
But to say I know more harm in him than in myself were to say more than I know. That he is old, the more the pity his white hairs do witness it. But that he is, saving your reverence, a whoremaster, that I utterly deny. If sack and sugar be a fault, God help the wicked. If to be old and merry be to be a sin, then many an old host that I know is damned. If to be fat be to be hated, then Pharaoh's lean kine are to be loved. No, my good lord, banish Pinto, banish Bardolph, banish Boynes. But for sweet Jack Falstaff, kind Jack Falstaff, true Jack Falstaff, valiant Jack Falstaff, and therefore the more valiant being as he is old Jack Falstaff, banish not him thy Harry's company, banish not him thy Harry's company, banish plump Jack, and banish all the world.
I do, I will.
Oh, my lord, the sheriff with a most monstrous watch at the door.
Out, ye rogue! Play out the play. I have much to say in behalf of that Falstaff.
Oh, Jesus, my lord, my lord.
Scene. Thank you, actors.
Thank you, everyone. Okay, so it's a little bit of a wild and crazy and riotous scene. What would you say about it? What can you say about it? What is going on there? Obviously it's a scene of play and fun. It plays like gangbusters on stage. What's going on politically in this scene? How are politics and power playing out, or just any aspects of the scene that you notice?
Well, I'm not sure it's political, but Falstaff definitely has a reality moment. At least you acted it that way. You know, that, wait a minute, what are you saying? That's not who I thought, that's not the relationship I thought we had.
Yes. It's because they're talking about Hal and Falstaff's relationship, even though it's supposedly a fictional scene between the prince and the king, the fictionality of it breaks down, and all of a sudden it seems to be real. And it seems to Falstaff, in the way that I played it, but I think it's there in the text too, it seems to Falstaff that, wait a second, you're not talking about Falstaff as your father, you're talking about Falstaff as yourself. And I thought you liked me. I thought we were friends. I thought when you became king, I've got it made for the rest of my life.
No, it feels like it's like he realizes that Hal is going to throw him under the bus.
Yes, exactly. Because there's that moment when he says, don't banish Falstaff. And Hal says, I do, I will. You wonder, is he speaking as the king who he's playing, or is he speaking as Hal? Perhaps he's speaking as both. I do banish you now as the king that I'm playing. I will banish you in the future when I am king and when the time comes.
Renaud did a cool thing where he flashed back to that in the movie.
Yes.
It's kind of poignant.
Yes, absolutely. Good.
Desperate self-promotion.
Yes, it's desperate self-promotion. It's desperate self-promotion. And it's self-promotion on so many levels because, first of all, he's trying to outdo him in playing of the king, right? Falstaff gets up there, and I mean, I hammerly overacted it, but just to stress the fact that Falstaff's trying to really win the audience, both the audience on stage, but also the audience in the theater. I think it's a competition between Hal and Falstaff as to who's going to be the best actor. And it's wonderful. It's a generational challenge as well. The best performance of this scene that I ever saw was two great actors. One was 75, the other was 30, and it was a contest between these two actors from two different generations too in this scene as they're trying to top each other. So just as Falstaff thinks he's doing a really great job, Hal, as the king, comes back and says, well, yeah, I know somebody I want you to banish. That Falstaff. And then all of a sudden, Falstaff's completely off his pins and is going to have to renegotiate, right? So they're competing for the loyalty of the stage audience, but also they're competing for the loyalty of the audience in the theater. And it's part of what's delightful about this scene is that Shakespeare is allowing them to be really theatrical, to really please you in the audience who paid your money to be there, right? Good. A couple of the things that I think are interesting here, and I don't want to, it's a fun scene, so I don't want to overread it, but through the theater, the signs of kingship, i.e. the crown, the scepter, are debased, right? The idea of the king's crown is that it belongs on the king's head and only on the king's head. In the theater, you've got in a theatrical scene, you've got Falstaff putting a cushion on his head and saying, this is the crown, I'm the king now, right? It's a parody. It's like you were saying, it's a satire of kingship itself. And if you think about the conditions of performance that Shakespeare's company is in the midst of, what are they doing? Even when the actor playing Henry IV himself comes on stage wearing his crown, you've got some lowly actor putting on a crown and saying, I'm the king. So I think what it does, what the play maybe does, is that it establishes that kingship, that political power generally, is theatrical. It's established and wielded through the props of authority, right? If you carry that scepter, if you wear that crown, we know that you're the king, right? Whether it's in the theater or whether it's in the Parliament Hall of Queen Elizabeth I, right? The one wearing the crown establishes themselves through that prop as being the one with the power. But I think the theater, by exposing that, tends to possibly debase the signs of authority. So I think this is a scene that really links kingship and performance. If the king is supposed to be the one who is king because he has the right to be king, here's a scene that says the king is the one who can play the role best. And it's interesting because elsewhere in the play, in scenes that we're not looking at today, Henry IV himself is struggling to figure out, how do I play the role of king? Right? I wasn't born to be a king. I only got this role because I stole it. It's equally, when Hal says, I'll play the king now, and Falstaff says, depose me. Well, the whole idea of deposing a king runs throughout Henry IV, Part 1. The king himself is only king because he deposed his predecessor. So Henry IV wants to say that everything that's going on in the tavern, it's all about these criminals and these lowlifes. But in a moment like that, and it passes very quickly, where Falstaff says, "Depose me," he's reminding us that the king himself is tainted by criminality. He'd like to project that criminality onto others, but he himself is probably the biggest thief in the kingdom. What else? Yeah, I mean, you guys have said about how that reality moment happens where you're not really quite sure. Falstaff, whether Hal's talking about from his own point of view or the king's, but when Falstaff seems to realize that Hal is making a promise about the future and that the good times for Falstaff are going to come to an end. So when he's saying, for sweet Jack Falstaff, kind Jack Falstaff, banish not him thy Harry's company, banish plump Jack, and banish all the world. And the prince says, I do, I will. It seems he's speaking in his own voice. And just at that moment, there's that fabulous knocking at the door, which I love. And that's, Rod, you hit it beautifully. You did a great job in the knocking. You couldn't have asked for better knocking. And I really want to hit the knocking because it seems to me there that knocking is a whole other world. It represents a whole other world. In the tavern, in a way, Falstaff is the king because he's the principle of play, of pleasure. He is a great actor. But for him to rule in the world of pleasure in the tavern requires the world of history, the world of duty, the world of politics, the world of warfare to be kept at bay, to be kept outside. And that knocking represents the eruption, the reintroduction of all the things that Falstaff needs to repress if he's going to be able to rule as the king of the tavern world. Because once the world of history comes knocking, and it is the sheriff at the door, the official world of history is knocking, Falstaff's day is over. Right? He can't function in the political world. He just wants to have a good time, and he wants to benefit from his powerful friend's position, but he doesn't actually want to contribute in constructive ways himself. So, I guess the last question is just to ask you to speculate on if Hal then is going to establish himself as this great king, partly by banishing the friends he's cultivated in the tavern, partly by banishing the world of the tavern. What is the cost for Hal, or by implication for any leader, of saying, I'm going to move into this position of leadership. I am going to be the responsible king that my father wants me to be. Right? Is there a cost, or is it all just reward?
I mean, the king is always a lovely person, and he usually has to. Then the king probably never knows who his true friends are.
Good, absolutely.
He'll be very isolated, and he won't have much interaction with the people that enjoy life, and it's sad.
Yeah. Because, oh, yes.
And it'd carry a feeling of fraudulence because he knows he's a manufactured being.
Yes, because from the time that he's a young prince, he seems to understand that his political role is a performance. There's a great moment in Henry IV, Part 2, where the King Henry is really sick, and he's on his deathbed, in fact, and the prince says to one of his friends, what would you say if I told you I was really sad about my father's sickness? And his friend says, I would call you a most princely hypocrite. I wouldn't be sad about his sickness? As soon as he's dead, you're king. Don't make me think you're sad about it. So at that moment, it's kind of a combination of what all of you have said. He has no genuine friend in whom he can confide. He has nobody who believes that he has a genuine feeling for his own father. And it's because of the role that he himself has constructed, that he himself has built. This role of, I don't care about my father, I don't care about my role. And yet, at that moment in Henry IV, Part 2, it seems to me that the role seems to exceed his power to control it.
That's the question on my mind was, is there any sense of Hal's feeling of affection toward his father or wanting to win his father's approval in all this mix? It's never there.
Yeah. I mean, he says it. There's a scene where he thinks his father is dead. He walks off with the crown. Dad wakes up. This is in Henry IV, Part 2, and says, oh my God, somebody's stolen the crown. My son took the crown. I always knew he couldn't wait till I was dead. And then Hal comes back in and says, oh, I thought you were dead. Please take the crown back, and I love you. And, right, and he tries So, but then the question is, you're faced with the always potential inauthenticity of human language, right? Because what do you say to Dad at that moment if you really do love him and you really don't want him to die? You say to him, Dad, I'm so glad you're still alive, take the crown back. But what do you say to Dad if you really did wish he was dead so you could be king? You say the exact same, Dad, oh, you're still alive, I love you, take the crown back, right? So the same speech, the same human language could actually indicate two opposite attitudes. So you never actually know, and this is the tragedy of a character who's caught inside a role. You never know where the authentic Hal is and where the role of king is.
Do you feel like he's trying to create like a complete line of separation where he's trying to be this young, irresponsible, let's just go have fun, and then I'll know at some point that will have to end, and then I will speak, and I will jump into my other role of becoming king?
Well, in fact, what happens when he becomes king is Falstaff hears that Hal has become king, so he runs to him and he meets him publicly, and he throws himself at the new king's feet and he says, my Jove, my prince, my Hal. And Hal does erect that wall. He says, I know thee not, old man. And he cuts off Falstaff, and everything from Act 1, Scene 2 of Henry IV, Part 1 has told us he's going to do it. But it's a powerful, powerful moment. And how you respond to it will tell you a lot about yourself and your own values and your own political ideas. Do you say, good, it's time for him to get rid of that Falstaff so he can become a good king? Do you say, whether he knows it or not, he's cutting off something very powerful. He's cutting off the man who has been his surrogate father. Do you say, what this shows us is that the price of being king, the price of being a great leader is your own very humanity. So, because I think I started this talk by saying many people look at Henry IV, Part 1 as a play about the process by which Hal grows into his leadership. You could tweak it. You could say, actually, you could reframe it and say, it's actually a play about the way Hal shrinks into his leadership. The Henry IV plays show you time and time again that he has to cut off some part of himself. He has to cut off and deny some part of his life in order to become the king that his father wants him to be. So I actually think, for me, it's a play that tells you a lot about the costs of leadership, and both in terms of the genuine, meaningful sacrifice that a leader has to make, but also less positively in terms of what it is that happens to our leaders when they have to make that sacrifice. Yes?
So a frustration of mine when I was in college was that so many people who had open-minded ideas in college left us when they went back to the family business or when they got into the workforce. That it seems like very few people 20 years later feel the same way or talk the same way or act the same way that they did when you were your students.
Right, right. And do they want 20 years later to hang out with the friends that they had in college? Don't know. You see, well, you're not Prince Hal. You're not Prince Hal.
But that's what strikes me about this. I see teaching it to students that they can draw from that we have glimpses sometimes of who we could be, but we tend to fall back as to who we are, right? And I think here, Prince here, he had a great Christian to fall back on. His father was the king, so he could go out and play with us, but he knew deep inside that he didn't have to be like us, and he could actually kind of manipulate that.
It is true. It's a very privileged position to be in. You can hang out and not plan for your future because it's taken care of. It's the ultimate trust fund. The man's going to be king of England, right? So he can go slumming, and he can manipulate and use people. He explicitly says in the speech that I've given you and in other speeches, I'm using these people. And it's part of his statecraft, right? I want to get to know these lowlifes in the theater because one day I will rule them. And if I understand their language now, I can rule them better when I'm king. So part of it is just this very cold and calculating sense that I'm educating myself in how to rule my people by getting to know my people. But then one always wonders, and there's no definitive answer to this, in making this plan, Is he strictly coldly political, or does he genuinely enjoy himself? And when he says to the audience, I don't really want anything to do with these people, is he fooling himself? Right? He's having a good time up there, isn't he?
I was going to say, isn't that even wanting to get to know the low life of the average person? Isn't that quite a switch from, for instance, the King's friends?
Yes.
Who had no desire to meet anybody on the street.
Yes. And yeah, absolutely. And it's very different from his own father, who says, I can't stand my son. He's hanging around basically with these lowlifes. What you need to do is you need to hold back as a king. You need to not let people see you. And then when they do see you, you'll seem like a wonder to them. But interestingly, Hal's strategy isn't that different. He says, they'll see me. They just won't see the real me. I'm holding back the real me. And that they're only going to get a rare glimpse of. And boy, will they be impressed by it. But I like that sense of different models of kingship, because Hal is a different model. And in some ways, many scholars have said that Shakespeare's plays about kings, his English history plays, in some ways prefigure democratic culture. Now, I'm not saying that Shakespeare could foresee the Declaration of Independence or anything like that, but in the sense that in the Shakespearean playhouse, kings, or actors playing kings, were subject to the scrutiny and the judgment of people who only had to pay a penny to get in, that this maybe culturally was significant in shaping a long-term political landscape. That normally, as a lowly person, a tradesperson, somebody with no status, in Queen Elizabeth I's England, you're not asked to judge the Queen. You're asked to bow, you're asked to get on board, you're asked to say great things about her. But in Shakespeare's playhouse, you are watching the actions of kings and queens day after day after day. You're seeing them make disastrous mistakes. You're deciding whether you like them, whether you don't like them. You're passing judgment on them as an audience. And, I don't know.
That's a new thing, is it? That's a new thing?
Yes, it is.
It's other drama earlier at the same time?
Well, I mean, if you go back to Greek tragedy, certainly, one could argue in a figure like Oedipus, who's a king, that you're watching, the mistakes and the tragedy unfold for a great king. But within the English Renaissance, this is an innovation, right? The medieval drama is primarily the drama of biblical stories or allegories about the condition of humankind. So this kind of specific political scrutiny of kings and queens is pretty new at this time. And in fact, there's this, the Queen and later her successor, King James, they had a censor, the Master of the Revels, who was very, very strict in trying to make sure that overtly inflammatory critiques of the church or of the royalty or of the government of the day didn't make it onto the stage. But what we're talking about here is a kind of a more general condition, that is the fact that the condition of performance itself and the fact that characters of kings and queens are open to audience scrutiny, there may be nothing overtly radical being said, but that that whole structure can be seen to be kind of radical because it's licensing people to have opinions, to have political opinions, and to make political judgments. Yes?
Are there any examples that you can think of in reality where you've had monarchs or rulers who started out as prodigal sons?
Yes. Yes. Well, I was saying at dinner at your house last night, I was saying one of the things that is so remarkable about teaching Shakespeare is you might teach the same play 5 or 6 or 7 or 10 or 20 or however many times, but it is a new play over and over again because the contemporary moment makes you see it differently than you saw it earlier. So when I would teach Richard II in the 1990s, and this is a play about how a very gifted and charismatic leader undoes himself by his own self-indulgence, by his own lack of self-restraint. It was always amazing to me that Shakespeare had foreseen Bill Clinton so accurately. And then a few years later, with Bush in charge, and then we have this scapegrace who's getting into all kinds of scandals and embarrassing the family, then emerging to become this sort of heroic figure, or at least tried to become this heroic figure in a time of national crisis. It seemed like that was a that was a prefiguration of the Bush story. So it's like everything old is new again.
Even Prince Harry, I mean, as you're talking about Prince Hal, I'm thinking this is kind of an analogy to what's going on in the royal family, with the young sons and them coming into adulthood.
These are stories that are specifically of their own time, but they're also enduring human stories about what happens when one power figure gives way to another, gives way to his or her successor. What happens when one generation sees itself superseded by the next generation, right? It's a father-son story. The father is watching the son grow up, and he's not the man that the father wants him to be. And the son is trying to move into adulthood, but he's got this looming figure of the father who's already written his future for him, right? This is always going to be a relevant story because it's a story that we all face as we're growing up or as we're getting older, as we're dealing with different generations, right?
There was also that play Bird in the late 60s where was on Broadway portraying Lyndon Johnson as Macbeth and JFK as Franklin Murray.
I saw a production a few years ago at the National Theatre in Britain. It was of Henry V. And it was a kind of a revisionist play because production, usually when Henry V is done, it's a great celebration, a nationalist celebration of this great warrior. This was Olivier's version of the film that he did in the 1940s during World War II to really rouse the British morale. And then, of course, they realized, wait a second, the French are our allies right now. We can't release this movie where we hate the French and beat up on the French while the war's still going on. So it wasn't until '46 that they released the movie. But it was this patriotic celebration. The production I saw was in 2003. It was just, the initial phase of the Iraq War was over and victory had been declared and stuff was declared to happen. This was the production done as Henry's invasion of France was represented as the American/British invasion of Iraq, and it was a very, very dark look at the play and at Henry's supposed heroism in relationship to this contemporary military adventure. And it was prescient because, at that time, we had no idea at that time about how badly wrong things were actually going to go, right? There were early signs, but... So, I think this is one way in which Shakespeare stays relevant, too. Contemporary theater artists or contemporary readers of Shakespeare find ways in which these plays can be used to speak about and to help us understand more clearly our own contemporary times. Any other questions?
Do we have one more question?
Okay, yeah.
I just thought, after listening to the mock performance, it reminds me of the controversy over Obama having to give up his BlackBerry, and that really the subtext there was cutting off his friends.
Yes. Yeah. That's right. I'm not sure what to add to that except to say, absolutely, you could sense in Obama. Everybody that I heard of his staff that was talking about it said, this is a real struggle. We want to get that BlackBerry away from him, but he wants to hold on to it. Right? It clearly meant something to him about the life that he was leaving to become president of the United States, and something he didn't want to give up. Did he ever give up his BlackBerry? I don't know how that story ended.
But then the other part I thought about was also that the presidents are always told to get dogs.
That's true. Because only your dog understands you if you're the president. Thank you all very much. It's a real pleasure.
We're going to come back and bring together the three faculty who've been talking today, and you'll be able to pepper them with any questions, and we'll see how things sort of synthesize and work together.